I think replication is pretty straightforward. Selection is also pretty straightforward. You remember the selective environment is, or the selective agents in an environment that a phenotype is born into. The selective agents are any factor that affect the probability of reproduction of the individual. And so they are effectively infinite. It's hard to draw a line around a selective environment. For example, for a bacterium, the selective environment includes all of the predators that might be after that bacteria. It also includes the chemical composition of the environment in which let's say it's a parasite, in which the host lives in. And the things or the world of chemical environments that the host lives in could trickle down and eventually affect the likelihood of reproduction of that bacterium. So very difficult to draw lines around or to clearly delineate what are the selective pressures on a species, but they are important to consider. The ultimate origin of variation in any given species is what we call mutation. And a mutation is any difference in the genome between the parent generation and the offspring. Now, in common speech, we think of a mutation as something bad, something wrong. The creature has a mutation, and so we sort of say, oh, well, that's bad. It confers selective disadvantage. Actually, that's not the case. Clinically speaking, or scientifically speaking, mutation simply means variation. It simply means a difference between parent and offspring. The other concept I wanted to get across was what kind of mutations can arise. Well, as you know, mutations occur on the genetic level, and DNA is changed between, or differs between parent and offspring. In sexually reproducing species, those mutations, those differences, largely come from what we call recombination, and this is the admixture of DNA from male and female, from the two sexes, in the production of the offspring. And when those DNA are essentially shuffled, the offspring look very similar to the parents, but they look slightly different. That's recombination, and it is one of the major sources of variation in sexually reproducing species. In asexually reproducing species, the bacteria, for example, that don't have male and female, how do we get variation? Well, you get some of it is mutation through chemical error, replication error, for example. Simply copying DNA, many millions or billions of base pairs of DNA, there are bound to be errors for all kinds of reasons. There are all kinds of errors, and those tiny errors are manifest as phenotypic variations, and they end up being selected upon. You can get variations that are sort of scalar or incremental in a scale sense. That is, you can get an animal that is quite a bit larger or smaller than the average. And the classic example with this is you take a classroom full of people and you line them up, and you take their weight or their height or whatever, and you get a normal curve. You have some people who are of average size. You have some people who are abnormally smaller, abnormally larger in weight or height or whatever. That's variation within a species. In humans, of course, it's very wide. For anatomically modern humans, we have people who are only 3 feet tall or 4 feet tall, and we have people who are 8 feet tall. But most of us are something on the order of 5'5" to 5'9", something like that. So you can get variation in that variety, in that respect. It's rare that you get sort of reorganizations, or it doesn't happen really that I know of, that you get structural, fundamental reorganizations of a species. And for example, you wouldn't have two elephants, a male and a female, have some offspring, and that offspring, that elephant, is born, let's say, with wings or with antlers. That kind of change takes time. What happens there is you get an offspring, a phenotype born with a sort of typically a prototype of that. Perhaps it's, horns are essentially pieces of hair. Horns are bundles of hair. Well, one animal is born, a phenotype is born with, we're bilaterally symmetrical animals, and the other mammals are as well. And so they're born perhaps with sort of a cone of hair up here that's kind of solidified and hard. And humans have variations like this. We're born with extra fingers. humans are born with extra vertebrae in their spine. It comes out as a small tail. We're born with all kinds of physical variations, big, heavy jaws, some people, lighter jaws, other people. So you get an animal that's born with sort of these horny bumps or these hairy bumps on its head, and over time, for whatever reason, if those are selectively advantageous, they become, let's say, horns, or these big, elaborate antlers. That's an incremental development of a particular species characteristic, and that's how generally species characteristics occur, not through sort of reorganizations of the entire genome. That's largely because of a phenomenon that is in evolutionary biology referred to as a Bauplan, B-A-U-P-L-A-N-E. The A has an umlaut over it from the German. This is a German word, Bauplan, and it refers to essentially blueprint. And what it's talking about is the genetic heritage of any given species. That genetic heritage, it structures sort of what the phenotype is going to look like. You can't just have any kind of variation. Again, two rhinoceros mating, their offspring are not going to be a porcupine or an eel. There's too much genetic heritage instructing, generally speaking, to make an eel or a porcupine. So there's constraint and there's also a bit of variation. Even during the life of the individual, there can be variation, and during the development of the organism, as biologists are increasingly recognizing, there can be significant variation that is not clearly or not so easily read directly in the genome. And so there's a whole new branch of evolution in the past 15 years called developmental evolutionary biology. And here what they're talking about, or one of the terms synonymous with that, is phenotypic plasticity. That is, the phenotype is plastic, it is mutable, it is changeable due to some things going on in the environment. You may have read about Lamarckian evolution, this variety of evolution proposed early on by Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who said that a giraffe's long neck came from giraffes who stretched their necks longer and longer, or they strived or strove, I don't know the word, to get higher up into a tree and to nibble at the vegetation, and those that stretched their necks higher were in better health and so on, and they passed that longer neck on to their offspring. That's Lamarckian evolution. Turns out it's false, that actually what you have is in a brood of offspring giraffes, some have a slightly longer neck, and they tend to do better, right? You're familiar with that now. They tend to do better, and they pass on the genes for a slightly longer neck. If Lamarckian evolution, strictly speaking, were true, or were correct, if I chopped off my finger, for example, my offspring would be born with missing a finger. So we know that Lamarckian evolution, strictly speaking, doesn't work. Having said that, there are environmental factors that can affect the development of the organism and thereby affect the gene pool of the next generation. So I just wanted to give you a sort of sense of the kind of complexity that's involved beyond the simplicity of replication, variation, and selection. When you see a characteristic of a species, the horn, the eye, the wings, the whatever the characteristic is, keep in mind it probably arose as an incremental process. There is a progenitor to it, or a precursor to it early on in the evolutionary history of that species. You may ask, where did it come from? Well, one way to start answering that is to think about its selective environment. What did that species have to do to survive? What was its selective environment? And also, what were the constraints on its evolution? We may as well, if we were an elephant, we may as well look at human beings and think, geez, why don't those creatures grow a nice, beautiful trunk? You can use trunks for all kinds of things. You can suck up water, you can tear down trees, you can pull vegetation off trees. Well, that's the same as a human being saying, looking at an insect or at some other animal and saying, geez, why don't those creatures develop gigantic brains and the kind of brain functions that we have today that we would call intelligence? Why don't those species do that? Well, partly it has to do with evolutionary heritage, and partly it has to do with different evolutionary selective environments.